Manin Gikendisokwe Indigenous Nipissing Donchipa. Hi everyone, my name is Maddie and thanks for joining us or welcome back to my channel if you're new here. So what I just said before the little cut is hello, my name is Gikendisokwe, which is my Anishinaabe name, which translates to intelligent woman, and I'm from Nipissing First Nation, though I have families to Serpent River First Nation as well. And what I didn't say is Happy Indigenous Peoples Day. I love National Indigenous Peoples Day. It's such a great day to just get to celebrate my culture and my background and just everything. I guess I have a dream catcher in the background. I didn't put on my funky earrings, but I should have. Yeah, so I just thought to talk about Indigenous History Month and National Indigenous Peoples Day, I would throw out some great Indigenous books that y'all should check out. So the first book/author that I'm going to talk about is Richard Wagamese. I've read 2 books by him, and I have another one on my shelf that I'm hoping to get to by the end of this month. The one that I really want to talk about is Indian Horse. This is a gorgeous story. I read it in high school, and it was one of those things where you were supposed to read the books in chunks by certain dates, and I just read it all at once. So then when people were talking about characters, I was like, I know more about them than you do, but I have to keep my mouth shut. It follows Saul, but he is sent to a residential school, and for those of you who are Canadian and maybe don't know, residential schools were put in place, I believe, in the late 1800s, and the last one closed in 1996, and essentially their goal was to assimilate Indigenous youth into Canadian culture by stripping them of their culture, their traditions, and their language, and just basically taking everything away from them. However, they were also rampant with sexual abuse, mistreatment, there was forced labor at most of these places. One of them in the north even had an electric chair. There was also testing that was done on the kids at these different residential schools, so they were really just all around awful, horrendous things, and to this day we're still trying to wrap our heads around how many kids' lives were lost. The number keeps getting larger and larger as they keep slowly finding more bodies, which is really unfortunate, but it's also really important that we keep educated about it and that we learn more about it. And while this book is fictional, it deals with the very real realities of what happened with residential schools and how to heal from that and how damaging that can be. So one of the things about this book particularly is it's very centered around hockey, because that is what our main character Saul finds that helps him get through the entire process, is being able to play sports and have that outlet to put all of his emotions into. It is a really gorgeous, if heartbreaking book, and I would highly, highly recommend it. The next book I have on my list is The Inconvenient Indian by Thomas King. This is a nonfiction book, and it essentially kind of chronicles not a complete history, but kind of an incomplete history of Indigenous peoples in Canada and the US, and this idea that they've always just kind of been in the way, and the government just likes to move them out of the way. So it's a really good introduction to history, but it's also a very good exploration of the way that Indigenous people are viewed to this day. So that's one of the things in particular that really resonates with me about this book. He talks about this idea of there being dead Indians, which is basically this idea that people expect Indigenous people to look like what they see in pictures, which is essentially usually in regalia that's used for dances and ceremonies exclusively. And there's live Indians, which are Indians who are just living their lives and aren't always looking like Indigenous people in the way that broader culture thinks Indigenous people should look. And then status Indians, which is this complicated government system that doesn't make any sense, that relies on blood quantum to look at who is and isn't Indigenous. But yeah, it's a really good introduction if you don't know a lot. Definitely something to read about, and even as an Indigenous person, I learned a lot, and there was a lot that I was able to resonate with in this book, so I would definitely recommend that you give it a read. The next book is The Outside Circle, and this kind of deals with gang violence and continued histories of violence and intergenerational trauma in Indigenous communities. This is a graphic novel, so there is some heavy content matter and also heavy content matter in a visual sense as well, but it looks at how finding culture in your own spirituality can be a source of healing. It is a very gorgeous book, another one that I would highly recommend that you check out. After that is Fatty Legs, and this book is written for more of a youth audience as an introduction to residential schools and what happened there. It follows the story of a young girl who goes to the residential schools and is essentially called out for having fat legs and made to wear these like red stockings that kind of separate her from everyone else. So another story that looks at the history of residential schools and what happened and how demoralizing and awful that was for the children who were there. Another book about residential schools, but clearly there's not enough because Canadians don't know about it, is Up Ghost River, which is a nonfiction book by Edmund Meditawaban, who is, or was, I'm not sure if he still is, a chief in a reserve in Northern Ontario, who also went to residential schools, and it's very much a terrifying account of St. Anne's Residential School, which is honestly probably one of, not that there is any ranking that needs to be done, but one of the worst residential schools. That was one of the ones that they had the electric chair at, and chronicling the abuse and trauma that he went through and how he's been able to heal and reconnect to his community and eventually get to the point where he was the chief of the community for a long period of time. So it's really a story about Indigenous resilience in the face of everything that tries to erase you. Next is Fire Song, and this was actually a movie before being turned into a book. And it follows two queer Indigenous youth, and it really deals a lot with the history of colonialism in the sense that in Canada, and I assume in the States as well, I'm not 100% sure, but we have the term Two-Spirit, which is an Indigenous term that's used to refer to people of different gender or sexuality, and it's basically this idea of having both male and female spirits in your body, and they were very well honored within our communities until the British came along and basically was like, that's wrong, you can't believe that, and stripped that from our communities. And because of that, there's a very complicated history of homophobia on a lot of the communities, and transphobia and biphobia. So this book really looks at what it's like to be a queer Indigenous youth growing up on the reserve and not necessarily feeling like you fit in and worrying about losing your family and kind of that feeling of hopelessness that can come from being in some of those communities. So it is a gorgeous book that is very well done and an important story that also needs to be told. The next one is another nonfiction memoir that's A Brief History of My Body, and this is another queer Indigenous memoir. This one and the last one that I have are both deal with kind of that queer idea of indigeneity, which I think is something that doesn't get explored enough and is really something that needs to be broken down to kind of get rid of or try and remove as much of that colonialist narrative as is possible. But yes, this book is by Billy Ray Belcourt, and it follows his, I guess, journey and his life as a gay Indigenous man and what that means for him and the ways that there's that intersection of his sexuality and his race and trying to learn and find his place in the world. It is gorgeous. It is very well written, very poetic. I was like highlighting like crazy when I was reading it. I don't know what else I can say to you about how to convince you to read it, but it's a story that isn't told enough and a story that I think is a lot more common than people realize. The last book is Jonny Appleseed, which was up for a Canada Reads Award, and it is a fictional story that follows this character, Jonny, who is a queer Indigenous person, and he's also a cyber sex worker, and essentially he's trying to make enough money to go home to the reserve where his stepfather has just passed away. And it deals a lot with what it is to be like Indigenous in the city, but also those same themes of what it means to be both queer and Indigenous and trying to, combat that history of colonialism and find your place and realize who you are. I wasn't really over the moon with it when I first read it, and I do talk about that a bit in my review of that book that I'll link up here. But the more that I watch them talk about it on the show, and the more that I've heard people talk about it in general, I've really changed my mind on it, and I think that there is a certain level of my own bias or my own uncomfortability when it comes to talking about sex that definitely went into some of my resistance with it. So I think it's been really interesting to hear some of those different perspectives and really kind of broaden my own perspectives when I'm looking at this book and trying to be an ally to these other people in the Indigenous community with me. So that's another book that I would highly recommend you check out. I'm actually going to see the author of this book speak virtually on National Indigenous Peoples Day, so that's something that I am super looking forward to. And yeah, I've definitely come on a long journey with that book, from really not liking it to actually kind of being in love with it now, and I'm almost wondering if I need to reread it to like fully give it the second chance that it deserves. But yeah, of course, like these, whatever, 8 or 9 books that I've talked about are only like the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Indigenous literature. These are all ones that I read, and I wanted to talk specifically about ones that I've read, but there's so many other amazing books by Indigenous authors that I haven't had a chance to read, and that you should definitely go out and explore more of, to read more of, because honestly, I think Read with Cindy talks about this in one of her videos, like, reading isn't going to solve anything. You're not like magically going to get rid of the history of colonialism or, you know, get rid of anti-Indigenous racism, but it is important to be able to recognize and understand stories from different communities, and this is one tiny little step about that. But also, please make sure you're going to figure out, you know, whose land you're on, teaching yourself about the legacy of residential schools and the 60s scoop, or whatever country you're in, whatever the history of mistreatment or the history of the Indigenous peoples of your country is. It's really, really important that we accept our own responsibility in educating ourselves and becoming more knowledgeable in these issues, so that we can become actively anti-racist and work to hopefully eventually eradicate them one day, so that we can all live in peace and harmony. So Chimagwech, which is thank you in Anishinaabe, for watching this video. It really means a lot to me that I have this platform to get to talk about this stuff. So thank you so much for coming on this journey with me. If you'd like to leave a comment down below, maybe share some of your favorite books by Indigenous authors, I would love to hear about them. Yeah, and make sure you like, subscribe, ring that bell so you get notifications when my next video comes out. And until then, stay kind.